Over the past few decades, crime has drastically changed throughout America. From 1920s age of Tommy gun-toting mafia bosses to the Bloods and Crips, and now the modern age of small sets and cliques fighting block-to-block warfare in America's inner cities. This video will delve into the history of American gang-related crime, and we will compare different types of crime and which type of crime is the most prevalent in our modern age. There are two types of crime we'll be covering: organized and deorganized. Organized crime, according to Merriam-Webster, is defined as crime committed by groups and planned to sustain criminal activities. Deorganized crime, however, is not an official term, but I'll be using it today to differentiate between organized and the more decentralized crime of the present day. Deorganized crime can be defined by the following characteristics: small groups of people, not necessarily with a leader or sense of organization or hierarchy, committing large amounts of crime in a small area. Deorganized criminal organizations usually don't occupy large amounts of territory and are confined to a very small area, such as a block in a city or a suburb of a city. To fully understand the evolution of crime in America, we need to go back to the past to analyze and compare the crime of then to now. 100 years ago, gang-related crime was dominated by the mafia and organized formations. Of a clear hierarchy and structure, the mafia of old was organized and had ranks and entire businesses and rackets being ran for money. During the time of Prohibition, bootlegging was also run by organizations similar to the mafia. The mafia is a prime example of an extremely organized criminal organization. During their height, they had entire businesses ran by them and had ranks of their organization. They had clear leaders and henchmen, and they indirectly controlled many places. However, the mafia style of organized crime began to decline from the 1970s to the 1980s, as the RICO Act became federal law. The RICO Act, in a nutshell, made it easier for organized crime formations to be prosecuted by the U.S. government, and the act allowed for the government to attack entire corrupt organizations instead of individuals. Before RICO, it was much harder to prosecute mafia bosses and etc. because they're all individuals. They weren't considered being one unified organization, and the government instead had to go after direct individuals and gather evidence on specific people instead of entire organizations, which is much harder than attacking the root source of the criminal organization itself. But organized crime would not disappear with the slow decline of the mob. In the 1970s and 1980s, the iconic, mostly black-dominated gangs of the Bloods and Crips were formed. Gang creation is almost always linked to poverty and lack of legal job opportunities. Without viable legal job opportunities, it's very hard to convince kids who are making thousands of dollars a week by selling drugs to go back to normal jobs where they earn less than minimum wage. The Bloods, on the other hand, were formed in opposition to the growing Crip influence and violence in Southern California. They were formed in 1972. Both gangs were similar in that they had ranks and organization, but they're split up into sets that would often fight each other and other rival gangs at the same time. In the 1980s, both gangs would experience an explosion of membership due to the crack cocaine epidemic spreading like wildfire in the United States. Weirdly enough, the crack epidemic has its roots in the Nicaraguan Civil War of the 1980s. The American-backed death squads called the Contras conducted atrocities and massacres against the Nicaraguan populace with the support of the U.S. government. But that's not all they did. They also introduced crack cocaine on a large scale into America, starting with San Francisco's Bay Area and spreading into the Los Angeles area, where the Bloods and Crips began producing and dealing it. The Contras were the direct link to the cocaine cartels of Colombia to the gangs of America. Oscar Danilo Blandon, a Contra leader in particular, was majorly responsible for the massive amount of drugs pouring into the U.S. at the time. Yet he barely served any time in prison, despite being the ringleader for this drug trafficking operation. And on top of this, he was using American taxpayer money to do it, as the American taxpayer money was being sent to the Contras to support them against the Sandinistas at the time. This American taxpayer money was used to funnel drugs into their own country. Blandon currently lives comfortably in Nicaragua to this day after only being in prison for 22 months. Meanwhile, blacks who consumed or even sold small amounts of the drug are serving life sentences currently in the world's largest prison system with over 2 million prisoners, and 25% of the world's prison population is also located inside of the United States. Unsurprisingly, America has the highest incarceration rate in the world. Much of this can be linked back to the war on drugs and segregation. Meanwhile, Blendone's boss, Juan Norwin Menses Cantarero, has never stepped foot in American prison. But according to federal records, he was a known cocaine kingpin and dealer since 1974. But he remained untouchable in the United States and had quite a large amount of freedom while he was living in the US.
I even drove my own cars, registered my own name. Blandon's lawyer, Brunin, said in an interview that his client never directly told him that he was selling cocaine for the CIA, but the prominent Los Angeles defense attorney drew his own conclusions from the atmosphere of CIA and clandestine activities that surrounded Blandon and his Nicaraguan friends. Was he involved in the CIA? Probably. Was he involved with drugs? Most definitely, Brunin said. Were those two things involved with each other? They've never said that, obviously. They've never admitted that. But I don't know where these guys get these big aircraft. After Nicaraguan police arrested Meneses on cocaine charges in Managua in 1991, his judge expressed astonishment that the infamous smuggler went unmolested by American drug agents during his years in the United States. His seeming invulnerability amazed American authorities as well. A customs agent who investigated Meneses in 1980 before transferring elsewhere said that he was reassigned to San Francisco 7 years later, and I was sitting in some meetings, and here's Meneses' name again, and I remember thinking, holy cow, how is this guy still around?
The icing on the cake for this entire CIA-Contra drug trafficking scandal is that Mentz's lawyer even acknowledged his involvement with the CIA. And 4 different American government agencies have come forward saying that the CIA and or
Unnamed national security interests
intruded and sabotaged investigations related to the Contra drug trafficking in the U.S. The journalist who exposed the CIA-Contra drug trafficking scandal was Gary Webb. After releasing his findings to the public, he became a victim of a massive mainstream media-led smear campaign, which caused him to lose his job, his marriage, and from eventually to off himself with 2 bullets to the back of the head. A strange circumstance, but it is possible for it to take more than 1 shot to do the job. Now that we understand where the crack came from and who brought it over, we can understand why America has such a large drug issue. Crack spread far and wide, and America's drug epidemic isn't just limited to crack, as we all know. The opioid epidemic in recent years has compounded the issue even more. Drugs made the environment in poor communities even worse. Violence was made worse, and people were losing the little money they had on buying drugs after they became addicted. Crack itself was a drug designed for people to get hooked to it. Drugs also made the violence worse as people became more aggressive and more sporadic with their behavior. An entire generation of urban Americans, mostly black, suffered tremendously because of the crack epidemic, and the gang violence that was made even worse by it. Eventually, the Crips and Bloods leadership began dying out due to infighting, and the organizations essentially shattered because of the constant loss of leadership. The 2 organizations became extremely decentralized. That's not to say that their business wasn't still booming, however. Drug dealing and crack cocaine was a multi-million-dollar industry, and it still is to this day. The story of the Bloods and Crips, like many gangs, was sadly repeated. Around the same time in the 1960s and 70s in Chicago, 2 new gangs were formed, the Gangster Disciples and the Black Disciples. Both had their origins in the 1950s socioeconomic factors because of the post-war decline, and in the 1960s civil unrest, which also hurt Chicago's black community even further. Job opportunities for young blacks in Chicago were scarce. The Black Disciples were officially formed in 1966 by David Barksdale. The founder of the BDs wanted to unite local small gangs into a larger, stronger one, similar to the Crips' beginning goal. The Gangster Disciples, GDs, were formed 2 years afterward in similar circumstances. In 1969, the 2 gangs merged, temporarily. But after Larry Hoover, the Gangster Disciple leader, was imprisoned, and Barksdale, the BD leader, was killed, the gang split apart again. They were on decent terms even after the split, but they're still relatively organized and continued massive drug trafficking with crack cocaine, heroin, and other drugs. They also had gun running and gun trafficking businesses in Chicago. This all lasted up until the 90s. In the early 1990s, the gangs had a falling out as the BD leader was killed by a GD. The GDs and BDs were organized and had ranks in a clear hierarchy. similar to the Crips and Bloods during their prime. They also had made millions off of the drug trade in Chicago. Even a Chicago DEA agent marveled at their discipline and business ethic and said they're possibly the largest and most successful gang in the history of the United States. The GDs and BDs during their height were a force to be reckoned with. They were able to control vast swaths of territory in Chicago. Larry Hoover is even compared to Al Capone, the most infamous mobster of all time. This all changed in 1995 when the DEA launched Operation Headache, where dozens of high-ranking GDs were arrested and imprisoned on hefty charges. Partner operations occurred at the same time, arresting other gang membership leaders, such as the membership of the BDs, Vice Lords, and many other gangs in Chicago. Larry Hoover himself was hit with 42 counts of conspiracy and was transferred to the ADX Florence Supermax prison in Colorado. To give you an idea about how serious that prison is, the Unabomber, Al-Qaeda members, Taliban members, mafia bosses, the Boston attackers, foreign spies, and more are sent to the ADX Florence Supermax prison. Larry Hoover was transferred from a Chicago prison so he couldn't communicate with the outside world, and he was in the most secure prison in the United States. With Hoover out of the way and him having no communication to the outside world, the gang's high-ranking lieutenants were also arrested. With all of the leadership being dealt with, the GDs were severely crippled. Mass arrests and convictions also happened to other gangs around the same time. This left gang members with no direction or any sort of leadership or centralization or any overarching goals. Violent crime began dropping in Chicago as a top-down approach of dealing with gangs seemed to have worked. But as we all know, Chicago is still a city associated with mass amounts of gun violence and crime. Ever since 2004, violent crime in Chicago has stopped declining. 2020 alone was a horrible year for Chicago, as the pandemic made gun violence even worse. Now that we have seen the gangs of the past, we can fully understand the gangs of the present in context. The BDs and GDs and other American gangs have relatively no leadership, and the head of the snake has been cut off, but the body has collapsed into shards of glass, all attacking and rivaling each other. Gang violence in Chicago isn't even based off of gang affiliation anymore. It is based off of block-to-block street politics. Sets in Chicago can be small as a street block, and they can include all sorts of different gangs in one set. BDs, GDs, Black P Stones, Mikey Cobras, and Vice Lords can all be in the same set, united together. Without leadership, most gangs of America have no direction or are left without any purpose, besides waging war with each other and continuing drug trafficking, of course. During the height of organized gangs in America, gangs were able to traffic thousands of arms into the country, especially in Chicago where gun running was a major business. Nowadays, without organized gun running, Chicago gang members can still get guns by simply driving into an Indiana gun show to pick up one and then head back into the city. Chicago's gang violence has devolved into a completely decentralized shit show of teenagers and young adults hopped up on drugs with a massive surplus and arsenals of guns left over from the heyday of the BDs and GDs and modern day just gun shows out of state. With these young adults and teenagers with a massive surplus of guns, they go around murdering each other over petty street beefs. Getting rid of the leadership has made the problem worse in some aspects. Instead of a highly organized drug trafficking empire that wasn't focused on killing necessarily, we now have thousands of blocks waging war on people who live across the street from them, with never-ending wars based on get back for fallen gang members and family. This is the perfect storm of conditions that have created a perfect environment for Chicago's violence to worsen, mostly in their black and Latino suburbs to develop into a literal war zone. This is why Chicago has the nickname of Chirac. Chicago's gang situation in modern times is a prime example of unorganized crime, but both organized and unorganized crime are horrible and should be avoided at all costs, but historically that has almost never happened in American urban cities. Throughout this video, we have seen the root cause of this type of crime: poverty. Chicago's black community has a high unemployment rate and high rates of poverty. Chicago, like most northern cities, also was redlined when it was being founded. Redlining is the practice of dividing up cities based on racial lines to keep blacks and other non-whites in poor neighborhoods, and to make sure poor neighborhoods have lackluster access to basic things such as clean water, and many other living standards have also been slashed in poor neighborhoods thanks to redlining. Inglewood, a largely black majority suburb of Chicago, with the most amount of crime in Chicago as well, has major issues of lead poisoning in their water and poor paint quality with lead inside of the paint. Lead in water and lead in paint contributes to lead poisoning, obviously. Lead poisoning is so bad, even the city of Inglewood acknowledges prevalence. Why is lead poisoning so bad, you might ask? Well, besides of obvious, poisoning, lead poisoning also shortens your lifespan, damages your brain, and people with lead poisoning are more likely to be aggressive. It messes with your brain's psyche. More aggressive teenagers with access to arsenals of guns and drugs is a horrible and atrocious combination that contributes even more to the violence. All the gangs we covered didn't have to be formed. People aren't destined to be gangbangers. They are born into conditions where living standards are so bad you lack any sort of safety, so you're practically forced to band together for protection, or for any sort of money, you have to go to illegal means to get it. The worst part is, Chicago's story isn't even a unique one. It's just a particularly bloody one that gets media attention every summer for the mass amounts of shootings and ridiculous crime rate there. Whether the crime is organized or disorganized, it doesn't matter, as long as the root conditions of poverty and unemployment prevail in that community. Violent crime will always be an issue, albeit it is an issue that can be remedied. Gangs wouldn't be formed if people had their basic needs met, and they wouldn't have to worry about having a source of income or form of protection. It is entirely our system's fault for having cities turn out this way, due to decades of incompetence, segregation, neglect, and the government's refusal to look at the root cause of all of these issues. Our system is rotten from the top down, and it will never tackle the root cause of these issues. Our system perpetuates poverty and exploitation, and they will never voluntarily change it. It is up to us, as Americans, to completely dismantle this atrocious status quo and replace it with something far greater